The rise of high technology was to be the salvation for America's economic ills and beleaguered workers. In the late 1990s, the high-tech boom did wonders for the economy, helping to reduce the jobless rate to its lowest level in decades and lifting wages at their fastest clip in recent memory. These days, it seems, if high-tech is going to be a salvation for anyone, it's for the workers in Bangalore and Beijing. We took to the streets of New York to see what some had to say about the current job market and get their opinion on the outsourcing of American jobs.
Everybody's trying to get a job as much as they can, but I think there's a need a little bit more for help.
I think the jobs should stay right here. Why are we going to send them overseas if we're not going to be able to benefit from them?
After the end of the Cold War, when more countries began to open up their doors to international trade and the exchange of jobs and services, the trend towards globalization began to increase dramatically. Currently, the newer players in this market are India, China, the Philippines, Russia, and South Africa.
When you have people from out of the country working our jobs, they're willing to give it for less money to move away, it gets to be unfair.
When factory jobs were headed overseas in the 1980s, young Americans were told there would be plenty of high-paying, high-tech jobs to replace the jobs that disappeared. Then in the early 1990s, many companies moved their computer chip production overseas, and we were told the good software jobs would remain in America. Now many of those software jobs are moving overseas, fueled by some stark numbers. American software engineers start at $75,000 a year, while many in India start at $15,000. An important book that shows how America's economy have shifted towards globalism is titled Outsourcing America: What's Behind Our National Crisis and How We Can Reclaim American Jobs. The author's two brothers, Ron and Anil Hira, expose information that shows despite the enormity of the stakes for all Americans, a state of denial exists among policymakers and outsourcing corporate champions about the adverse effects on the United States. They discuss policies that countries like India and China use to attract U.S. industries, and they offer frank recommendations that businesses and political leaders may want to consider in order to confront what they call a snowballing crisis in a bid to bring more high-paying jobs back to America. Ron Hira is Associate Professor of Public Policy at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and he joined me via Skype to talk more about his book. I started by asking him if offshore outsourcing was a way for American corporations to get out of the Depression in the early 2000s.
Well, I think what happened was that corporations figured out a way of making profits through cost cutting. So in the late 90s, they were able to make profit through innovation and creating new devices and pushing sort of the technological frontier. And then in the early 2000s, they figured out that they can make money by attacking costs. And one way to attack costs was basically to adopt offshore outsourcing.
Hira tells me that while at times outsourcing is done because of certain technological capabilities, the main reason almost always goes back to low-cost labor.
Much manufacturing went offshore, both in the 90s as well as the 2000s. White-collar offshoring is really driven by labor costs, and even much more so than manufacturing, because if you think about it, software, IT, call centers, business process outsourcing, these kinds of services sectors and jobs, labor is probably about 70–75% of the overall cost. And so if you have a wage differential in terms of labor and you can save significant amounts of money, you're going to do it and you're going to get a huge return. And we saw that with these companies. So really driven by profit motives and ways to reduce costs by substituting lower cost labor overseas for American workers.
Hira says that ultimately the change has to come from Washington, and until the government continues with its public policies that favor the companies rather than workers, the status quo won't change.
You know, we've been at the white-collar debate for more than 10 years now. So the debate started in 2003. And the reality is, even though we've had multiple presidential campaigns, including just the most recent one in 2012, where outsourcing and offshoring was a big issue, in the campaign, and President Obama really went after nominee Mitt Romney on offshoring. The reality is that the government has done nothing in response policy-wise. So that's the first thing, is to point out that at least politically, our politicians have chosen to do nothing in response to offshoring and outsourcing. There's a number of steps that we could and should be taking, policy-wise, I think pretty sensible ones. The first thing is getting your arms around, how much is going offshore, getting data and trying to understand what's going to be geographically sticky, what's likely to stay, what's likely to go, and things like immigration policy, where we're actually putting a thumb on the scale to make it easier to offshore. I think we could try to fix that. Unfortunately, the current immigration bill that's being debated right now doesn't go far enough to close those loopholes out. Tax policy. The larger point, though, is this is a large phenomena, and there's no single silver bullet. There's a number of things that need to be done in response. But the reality is that the folks who are benefiting, the interest groups that are benefiting the most, Wall Street and shareholders and large corporations, they love the status quo. So the policy 101, what I tell my classes, our system of government in America is set up. The easiest thing to do is to introduce a bill in Congress. The hardest thing is to get something through. And so it's the industry and the people who are benefiting from outsourcing are in a strong position because they've been able to kill any good ideas along the way.
I headed to meet up with my next guest. I scheduled an interview with Paul Alois. Adjunct professor at Baruch College, Paul Alois teaches 2 undergraduate classes, Introduction to International Relations and The United States in an Age of Globalization. He was also a former consultant for the World Bank. Alois believes another change that's affecting jobs is already happening, and it's one that we're not prepared for. But first, on the issue of offshoring, my guest says that outsourcing is happening in a strange economic environment. American workers today face a very insecure labor market, even though the economy continues to grow.
I was having lunch with my mom over the weekend, and she was talking about her uncles, and she told me that all of them dropped out of college. And it was because they were in Pittsburgh, and if you lived in Pittsburgh in the 1950s, then you could get a fantastic job in one of the local industrial plants, and you didn't need to have a college degree, so there was just no point in going to college. And so her generation sort of grew up with this belief that you were entitled to that kind of a secure job that would last you from 20 to 60, and then you'd have a pension and you'd live out the last 10 years in Florida fishing or whatever. But the labor market today, and for people like me who are now entering the labor market, it's a lot, people don't see those kinds of guarantees anymore.
According to my guest, other industrialized countries which are facing the same pressures as the United States are not experiencing a loss of their middle class. This is because of government redistribution, stronger labor power, and closer coordination of their economies. Germany and Denmark are examples.
In a country like Denmark, and Denmark is often considered the sort of best-run country in the entire world, you have incredibly powerful unions, but they believe that it's their job to work with employers to promote the economy as a whole. And so actually the head of the Danish labor union is in favor of outsourcing because she wanted to get the low-skilled, low-value-added jobs out of Denmark, send them off to Indonesia, and then have the Danish people doing the really high-value-added work. Whereas you really never see that in this country.
Alois notes that while outsourcing is a valid concern, the bigger problem is technology. Technological changes is also eliminating jobs. Is it technology or outsourcing that's the bigger problem for workers? My guest stresses that the revolution in computers and robotics will affect the U.S. labor market more swiftly and severely than outsourcing. If machines can do most of the work that humans are now doing, then the government will have to tax the owners of machines to compensate unemployed workers.
If you think about outsourcing and then also technological change, so having computers and robots do work that humans do, both of those really favor people who have a lot of capital. Right, so the shareholders in a company, and it's like the wealth. So the amount of capital is highly unequal. So it's very few people have most of the wealth in America, and so they're the ones who are really benefiting when the stock market benefits. And so if you imagine a company like let's say General Motors, they close down a factory in the US and they send the factory to Indonesia. But then they keep a lot of the management and a lot of the sort of higher skilled things here in the US, right? And so they're saving costs by sending the factory to another country. And then they're able to make more money and then pass that on to the shareholders, right? So the owners of capital are benefiting a lot from outsourcing. And then the owners of capital are obviously benefiting when a human is replaced by a robot, because now let's say the human used to add $1,000 of value and then they would have to get paid $900, right? Well, the robot adds $1,000 and it doesn't require a salary. So that $1,000 goes to whoever owns that piece of capital. And so capital owners are doing really, really well in this new economy. Actually, Paul Krugman had a good op-ed on it this week where he, and this is sort of a widely known fact, that the ratio of income going to labor and to capital has been historically pretty much the same in the US for about 40 years. And then 10 years ago, the ratio started changing, so capital began getting a lot more of the returns from profit. And so going into the future, I think that Americans need to be more clear about taxing capital more and making the owners of capital pay for more public goods. And so there's straight redistribution, which is just sending people a check, but that's not really what I mean. What I mean more is paying for schools. You know, we should have some sort of minimal public health care. I mean, we actually do have public health care now. It's just people go to the emergency room, and then either the hospital or the government picks it up. So, you know, the people who own capital should be funding these kinds of services.
This, he says, requires a profound change in culture and politics, two things that don't change slowly. In terms of government policies, Aloy says that America seems to be on the right track in opening its doors to free trade.
Whenever an industry is going to be hurt too much by free trade, then it's able to go to Congress and get some kind of short-term protection, and which I think is completely appropriate. You know, I believe in eventual free trade between all countries. And you know, if people are skeptical of that, then you could just try to imagine the opposite. Imagine if the state of New York decided that there'd be no trade with other states. You know, and there's 24 million or 27 million people in the state of New York, so that's like the size of a country. We could, in theory, cut ourselves off from all other states, but no one could imagine that would be good, right? So in the same vein, it must make sense that it would be good for countries to trade between each other. But eventually, right, if free trade happens too quickly, then it can be really disruptive for people. So I think, you know, in general, America's moving towards free trade, as are other countries, but we're putting in place decent restrictions to prevent people's lives from being disturbed too much. But I guess when people lose a job, they don't feel like the restrictions were enough.
Eric Draitser is a geopolitical analyst and media commentator. Hosting his own podcast, he has done extensive work on the financial crisis and interviewed many individuals who have been affected by the slow economy, prevalent in recent years. His website, stopimperialism.org, unapologetically speaks truth to power.
There is a growing consciousness, particularly among young people, about this economic situation, and they feel it on a very personal level, as I mentioned, when they come out of university and expect to be able to find that job that was promised to them since they were children, and that job isn't there. That's a very difficult thing to deal with, but I would stress this, though. Despite the growing consciousness, particularly among young people, their situation is so much worse than their parents' situation was that it makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to really organize themselves and mount true opposition. What I mean by that is, how easy is it for a person who's 24 years old and has $150,000 of student debt to be politically active, to be able to put in jeopardy their possibility of a career, of moving forward, of growing up in some company or whatever, putting that in jeopardy for what? For struggling against a system? Well, certainly I would advocate that, but for most young people, that is not going to be their top priority. Their top priority is going to be, how do I get myself out of this web of debt that I'm stuck in, that I will be stuck in for the next 25, 30 years, while at the same time beginning to build a life for myself. You know, getting married, having children, buying a car, buying a home, you know, whatever. All of the things that we think of as typical middle-class America, how is that even possible for young people today? Well, it's not really, in effect, unless you're one of the, the lucky ones, but most people are struggling terribly, and they're drowning in debt. So the question of consciousness is important, but it should be balanced against the brutal reality that many people are facing, but it is not just students. Let's take a look at another very marginalized group in the United States. People who are now homeless because they have been foreclosed on by banks. Okay, these are people who, whether they got into their homes, because they should have been or shouldn't have been, is irrelevant at this point. They had homes, they no longer have homes. And the question is why? And the answer is because the policy is in place that the banks are able to profit off of the misery of these people. Not only are they able to profit off of the debt itself by securitizing it and selling it in the form of mortgage-backed securities and the various other financial instruments that these banks use. Not only are they able to do that, but they're also able to take over the homes themselves and then sell them to hedge funds and various other speculators who then sell them to somebody else. So in effect, there's a chain reaction happening here in the economic sphere that continues to allow corporations to profit and continues to force people into positions of submission or oppression or whatever you want to call it. And that we can generalize that more broadly to the vast swath of America. And that is why America is a depressed nation, whether we want to call it a depression or not.
In the past decade, work in manufacturing shrank nearly a third, from 16.9 million in 2000 to 11.5 million in 2009. A recent study by the Pew Charitable Trust concludes that, quote, many of the manufacturing jobs that were lost have not returned. With the issue plaguing him in the presidential race, Obama held a White House forum in January 2012 featuring companies that had insourced jobs, whether by bringing them back to the U.S. or by creating new ones. The forum celebrated companies that had returned call centers, among other functions, to American shores. Then, in his State of the Union address, President Obama highlighted MasterLock, which had brought several jobs back from abroad. For the first time in 15 years, Obama told Congress MasterLock's unionized plant in Milwaukee is running at full capacity.
The notion that Obama is somehow moving forward in terms of addressing this issue runs counter to every single policy that he's ever put in place. Obama is, in many ways, the most dutiful servant of Wall Street that we've ever had. Where you could say that, generally speaking, for the last 30, 40 years, the Republicans have been associated with big industry, big oil, and so forth. Well, the Democrats are associated with Wall Street and speculation and hedge funds and the rest of them. And Obama, just like Bill Clinton before him, very much fits into that mold. So if we want to look at actual concrete policies, let's look at something like Obamacare, right? Obamacare is a hot button issue in the United States, but is that really a policy in the interests of working people? No, it's a policy that was designed by and for the insurance industry. If you look at the major insiders who are part of framing that legislation, creating the legislation, they were directly out of the insurance industry. The same is true with Dodd-Frank and Wall Street and the regulation of finance. The same is true with Monsanto and the regulation of the agricultural industry and big agribusiness. The same is true with the pharmaceutical companies. So what does this all tell us? It tells us that rather than Obama putting forward any productive policy ideas, Obama's policy is shaped entirely by the 1%, entirely by the ruling class.
During his first term as president, Barack Obama met with top Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. After decades of watching companies outsource jobs to other countries, the president wondered how he could bring them back by insourcing. Obama zeroed in on Apple's then CEO Steve Jobs to see if it's possible for Apple, the most successful IT firm on the globe, to bring the manufacture of iPhones back to the United States. Jobs' answer was simple: those jobs aren't coming back. Much of the company's engineering is done in the U.S., but almost everything in the array of Apple products is manufactured abroad. When Apple needs fast production changes and high-quality results, foreign manufacturers can do what American companies simply can't.
So for him to take his cues from Steve Jobs, I think the more interesting question would have been if he could have asked Steve Jobs what happened to the tens of billions of dollars of tax revenue that the United States was deprived of by Apple's policy of using tax tax loopholes to hide their assets in various countries? Why is it that that same pattern is repeated not just by Apple, but by General Motors, by Verizon, by every major transnational corporation? What you see is, as I mentioned earlier, this is a systemic issue. There is a systemic problem in the United States, in the U.S. economy, and particularly with regard to the way that we are governed. We are not governed by elected officials. We are governed by elected officials who work in the interests of corporations and finance capital. In other words, there is a marriage between government and private industry.
And if you're wondering about the number of jobs leaving the United States and facts and figures, according to the Statistic Brain website, the total number of U.S. jobs outsourced in 2011 was a little over 2 million. That's 53% in manufacturing, 43% in IT services, 38% in R&D, 26% in distribution, and 12% for call or help centers.